Hofstra'S Disability Heritage by Thinking Disability Futures, presented by Hofstra'S Disability Studies program, part of Hofstra College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. I'm Dr. Andrea Nerlish, she, her pronouns, the director of the graduate programs in rehabilitation counseling in our School of Health Professions and Human Services. For those who can benefit from a visual description, myself and the 5 panelists are sitting at a table with a yellow drape on it, and I am a white woman in her mid-40s with my hair in a bun, a mask on, and a black top. I'm privileged to be invited into this space and for these conversations. I want to acknowledge and welcome Dr. Susan Poser to our event and thank her for positioning disability and inclusion as a priority issue for her inauguration events. Today's discussion will highlight the foundation of disability activism on our campus, while also recognizing the important work left to do, here and more broadly. The Americans with Disabilities Act and its amendments offered promises of accessibility and inclusion for disabled citizens, though these realizations haven't been fulfilled to their potential. Considerations are often relegated to architectural barriers, negating diverse needs beyond physical limitations. Inequity has been insidious and common for people with disabilities, which has only been magnified during the pandemic. To realize a future with inclusive healthcare, employment, education, and community arenas, we must center the needs and voices of all disabled people. For that, I turn to our esteemed speakers. Each of our speakers will present their conversations in turn, and then we'll open the session for a question and answer period. Let me introduce the full panel. Dr. Craig Rustisi, he, him, is Professor of English, Director of Disability Studies, and the Dr. Mervyn Livingston Schloss Distinguished Professor for the Study of Disabilities at Hofstra University. Initially trained as a scholar of early modern English literature, he's published articles in Spencer Studies, Renaissance and Reformation, Studies in Philology, and Modern Philology. His book, The Afterlife of Pope Joan, Deploying the Popess Legend in Early Modern England, explores literary representations of the woman who, according to medieval legend, cross-dressed her way to the papacy. More recently, Dr. Rustisi has presented and written on disability studies, including disability representations in fiction by Nathaniel Hawthorne, H.G. Wells, and Kurt Vonnegut. As you'll see, he's currently researching the history of disability activism at Hofstra. He's also advising students working to establish a Hofstra chapter of DREAM, Disability Rights, Education, Activism, and Mentoring. Following that, we'll hear from 2 members of the class of 2023, Gabriella Hall and Sunjita Bhattacharya. Bree, she, her, is a drama major and disability studies minor who serves as the vice president of DREAM Hofstra. Sunjita, she, her, is a sociology major with a minor in disability studies in the pre-law program at Hofstra. She currently serves as the secretary for the e-board for DREAM Hofstra. As mentioned earlier, DREAM stands for Disability Rights, Education, Activism, and Mentoring. DREAM Hofstra, a part of the DREAM National Network, advocates for student rights, increased accessibility, social and policy change, and aims to provide support and mentorship to the individual students. DREAM serves to be a space where disabled students can be in community with each other, and equally, as a space for organizing change for more accessibility on campus. Sunjita and Bree's remarks today have been formed in community with their disabled peers at DREAM and reflect the experiences of a multitude of students, including their own. Third in our session is Professor Kevin Berry, he, him. Kevin's work focuses on civil and human rights issues, including trans rights and disability rights. He teaches administrative law and disability law and is the co-director of Quinnipiac University School of Law's Civil Justice Clinic, representing low-income clients through a combination of direct legal services and policy advocacy. Prior to teaching, he was part of the legal team that worked to pass the ADA amendments of 2008. As a litigator, Kevin has worked on numerous cases asserting ADA claims in support of transgender litigants. Our final speaker is Lydia X.Z. Brown, they, them. Lydia is an advocate, organizer, attorney, strategist, and writer whose work focuses on interpersonal and state violence against disabled people at the intersections of race, class, gender, sexuality, faith, language, and nation. They are Policy Counsel for Privacy and Data at the Center for Democracy and Technology, focusing on algorithmic discrimination and disability, as well as Director of Policy, Advocacy, and External Affairs at the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network. Lydia is also adjunct lecturer and core faculty in Georgetown's Disability Studies program, an adjunct professorial lecturer in American University's Department of Critical Race, Gender, and Culture Studies. They serve as a commissioner on the American Bar Association's Commission on Disability Rights, chairperson of the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice Section's Disability Rights Committee, board member of the Disability Rights Bar Association, and representative for the Disability Justice Committee to the National Lawyers Guild's National Executive Committee. Lydia founded the Fund for Community Reparations for Autistic People of Color's Interdependence, Survival, and Empowerment, and they are creating Disability Justice Wisdom Tarot. Lydia is past chairperson of the Massachusetts Developmental Disabilities Council and former Justice Catalyst Legal Fellow at the Breslin Center for Mental Health Law. Often, their most important work has no job, title, job description, or funding, and probably never will. It's my pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Rustisi.
Thank you. I am a white male in his 50s. I'm wearing a black sport coat. I want to offer special thanks to 3 people who helped me learn what I'm going to be presenting today. Deborah Willett, who is the archivist here at Hofstra, and 2 excellent student research assistants, Amanda Labrage and Carolyn Terwanka. I won't be reading the slides, but if anyone wants to email me, I can share the slideshow with them. There are at least 2 stories to tell about disability history at Hofstra. One concerns administrative initiatives to create an accessible university, and the other less known story concerns the campus activism of students with disabilities. I will offer a survey of each. Maybe more efficient, I'm not sure. This one? Okay, thank you. Gotcha. So I'll offer a brief account of each and suggest some factors that might have helped bring them about. To conclude, I will briefly recount the careers of a few alums with disabilities. That first top-down story is well documented, even through this plaque outside Hager Hall. I'm sorry. Oh, okay, sorry.
I moved it.
Oh, okay. In 1963, the Hofstra Board of Trustees resolved to make this campus accessible to people with physical disabilities. 18 years later, Hofstra celebrated becoming the first American private university to be architecturally barrier-free. At that time, only Berkeley and the University of Illinois were similarly accessible. In addition to installing ramps and lowering some water fountains and public telephones, Hofstra collaborated with the Otis Elevator Company to develop and install exterior wheelchair lifts, a relatively inexpensive way of retrofitting multi-story buildings constructed without elevators. The university also commissioned a documentary film promoting the means and benefits of removing architectural barriers. If you could advance that one. Hofstra's program for the higher education of the disabled oversaw these efforts. And one more slide. So this timetable tries to establish a context for those efforts. I'll highlight a couple items. The 1964 Civil Rights Act is on that timetable because of what it didn't do. It made no mention of people with disabilities. The 1968 Architectural Barriers Act required that new federal or federally funded buildings be accessible. The 1973 Rehabilitation Act, with Section 504, prohibited discrimination against people with disabilities in federally funded programs. But as you'll see, it took 4 years for that law to be implemented. So, Hofstra undertook this initiative decades before the ADA, a decade before passage of Section 504, and 5 years before the Architectural Barriers Act. You could give me another slide. So one of the things I found in the archives was something that I can only interpret as what slideshows used to be before PowerPoints. It's a series of these 8.5 by 11 sheets. They're now protected in clear plastic. They have, in some cases, not much text on them, and they seem to be almost the pitch for this initial 1963 program. So I'll start with the question, or I'll pursue the question that is in largest type here, why Hofstra? I'll start with the most cynical answer, tuition. Particularly after passage of the 1965 Higher Education Act, financial support for students with disabilities made them a potentially valuable source of tuition revenue. That slide, or another part of this, what I'm calling a proto-slideshow, reports that the New York State Office of Vocational Rehabilitation was prepared to refer 40 students using wheelchairs each year. 1981 Newsday article quotes a Hofstra administrator explaining, quote, "When we started the program, it seemed not only a humanitarian thing to do, but also enabled us to widen the pool of qualified students who could attend the university." Of course, cynicism only gets you so far. Altering the campus infrastructure entailed its own costs. Tuition revenue alone, which did not quickly motivate lots of other schools to undertake such initiatives, doesn't offer a sufficient explanation. If I get the next slide. Also on that same sheet is a reference to Hofstra's topography as facilitating accessibility. Having walked a relatively vertical campus such as Lehigh University, I recognize the point. A relatively flat, compact campus is easier to navigate in a wheelchair. Low-rise buildings require less retrofitting with elevators. And one more slide. I'm sorry, I think we're behind one. Can you give me one more?
Behind one?
There we go, yeah. And this map is also included in those sets of documents, so we're kind of thinking about the early compactness of the campus. And then there's the first item on the sheet. Next slide. It would be difficult to overestimate the impact of the partnership between Harold Euch and Henry Viscardi. And one more slide. Euch, a Hofstra psychologist born with cerebral palsy, researched disability and developed in 1960 the widely used Attitudes Toward Disabled Persons scale. He served on the original Fed committee and led Hofstra as provost from 1973 to 82 during the completion of the Accessibility Initiative. Henry Viscardi was born with stumps rather than legs, spent his first just 6 years in hospitals, and was first fitted with prostheses at age 26. After counseling soldiers severely wounded in World War II, he directed Just One Break, a job placement program for workers with disabilities. We'll get the next slide if we could. In 1952, he founded Abilities, Inc., a nonprofit demonstration project employing workers with disabilities to perform subcontracted manufacturing. A decade later, in 1962, he founded the Human Resources School for students K through 12 with severe disabilities. He too served on the original Fed committee. He even made a cameo appearance in the promotional film. If you could advance to the next slide. Collaborations between Hofstra and Viscardi began years before the university launched Fed. By 1956, Assistant Professor Harold Euch was working with Viscardi and Abilities, Inc. to research the physical, emotional, and social impacts of employment upon previously unemployed workers with disabilities. From 1958 to 1969, the research arm of Viscardi's Abilities, Inc. published 9 monographs by Euch. If you could advance again. Euch contributed a scholarly and personal engagement with disability. In turn, Viscardi contributed a decade's experience organizing an accessible workplace, more recent experience developing an accessible school, and a determination to find college placements for his graduates. Through his career, Paul Hearn seemed to enact the partnership between Viscardi and Hofstra. Next slide. Born with a brittle bone disease that prevented him from growing more than 4 feet tall and frequently necessitated that he wear a body cast, Hearn attended school from home until he was 15. Then he enrolled in Viscardi's Human Resources School, where he flourished. At Hofstra, he won election as Student Senate President, defeating future U.S. Senator Norm Coleman, then a long-haired anti-war protester. As the Newsday headline, which says "Students Vote Out Activist," suggests, at Hofstra, Hearn was more of an institutionalist than an activist. However, after he graduated from Hofstra Law, events pushed him toward legal activism. He took a job with the Legal Services Corporation intending to focus on poverty law. After 2 years, though, the Brooklyn office where he worked was relocated to the second floor of an elevator-less building, necessitating that colleagues carry him up and down a flight of stairs every workday. That experience prompted him to establish an accessible legal services office to represent people with disabilities. He soon co-wrote the first handbook on the legal rights of disabled people. You can advance again. Like Viscardi, for several years he directed Just One Break. Later, as director of the National Council on Disabilities, an independent federal agency advising the executive and legislative branches, he played a part in drafting and advancing the Americans with Disabilities Act. And you could, oh, great. No, you were good, thank you. Sorry. Hearn's later activist career leads us to that second bottom-up narrative about disability student activism at Hofstra. And now you can advance. In her memoir, The Me in the Mirror, Connie Panzerino, who relied upon a wheelchair, recounts founding in 1968 the Hofstra student activist group People United in Support of the Handicapped, or PUSH. The university refused Panzerino's request to dorm because there were no first-floor dorm rooms and she might be unable to evacuate from an upper floor. Consequently, she would be, as they thought, a fire hazard. So Panzerino circulated a flyer and held a meeting. A year later, she reports, we had over 150 members, including students, staff, teachers, and administrators with disabilities and without. PUSH offered peer counseling, lobbied politicians in Albany and Washington, next slide, raised funds for accessibility enhancements, made outreach visits to the Bronx VA hospital, and organized a self-proclaimed freedom ride on the Manhattan subways to protest inaccessible public transit. Students sometimes grew impatient with Hofstra's progress toward accessibility, particularly in fall 1970 after the university replaced the steps outside Hofstra Hall without adding a ramp. At the same time, Hofstra opened a new gymnasium with an empty elevator shaft. Funds were exhausted before the elevator was installed. PUSH members or allies on the Chronicle staff reported on and editorialized about these shortcomings. Next slide. In May 1971, Associate Dean of Students and Director of Fed, Stuart Cedar, resigned under pressure, blamed perhaps for decisions he did not make. PUSH remained active in one form or another through 1981. The disability scholar Lindsay Patterson has identified Hofstra as one of the 5 American campuses with the most active disability rights movement in the 1960s and 1970s. So that same question arises again. Why Hofstra? I'll offer some preliminary answers. Whatever its shortcomings and stumbles, the program for the education of the handicapped invited a critical mass of students with diverse disabilities to campus. Keep in mind that at most universities, the PUSH generation of alums were denied admission long before they had any opportunity to press for accommodation. In his memoir, alum Robert Morrow estimates that when he joined PUSH in 1968, 80 students with disabilities were attending Hofstra. For a second contributing factor, I turn again to Harold Euch as the most notable of several faculty whose teaching, research, and advocacy at the time concerned disability. In her memoir, Panzerino recalls Euch addressing her first-year class. He spoke with slurred speech, she writes. his face contorted with muscle spasms. He talked about civil rights, the right to be autonomous. I savored each word and imprinted them in my mind. If we take seriously the notion that seeing it empowers you to be it, then Euchre's presence likely fostered disability action. Nor was Euchre the only openly disabled faculty member. Joe L. Carter, who had survived a paralyzing auto accident years earlier, taught secondary education and played on Hofstra'S wheelchair basketball team. That brings me to a third factor. Next slide. The Rolling Dutchman. Hofstra fielded only the second U.S. collegiate wheelchair basketball team, and since the first was at the University of Illinois, for some time the Rolling Dutchmen were the only collegiate wheelchair basketball team on the East Coast. Wheelchair basketball developed in rehabilitation centers for wounded World War II vets, and by the late 1960s, several club teams competed in metropolitan New York. To found the Rolling Dutchman, Hofstra student Mark Drummer recruited some players from the Brooklyn Whirlaways, a nearby club team that he also brought to campus for an exhibition game. Mixing metaphors, perhaps, I think of the Rolling Dutchman as a crossroads and gathering place. Because most years wheelchair basketball was a club sport, NCAA eligibility rules did not govern the Rolling Dutchman. So Joe Carter played alongside undergraduates. The team included some world-class athletes, at least one Paralympian. Their opponents on the Eastern Paralyzed Veterans Association Chargers represented an advocacy group that had lobbied for the Architectural Barriers Act and exposed the appalling conditions at the Bronx VA hospital. The Rolling Dutchman, who sometimes played exhibition games against stand-up basketball teams, demonstrated that disability and athleticism could converge. Next slide. Students with disabilities who did not play on the team participated as statisticians or self-proclaimed cheerleaders. The Rolling Dutchman fostered a sense of community and competence that could energize activism. I'd like to turn now to the careers of just a few Hofstra Push alums. Connie Panzerino continued her activism after graduation. She struggled to find work, but once she did, encountered a pernicious catch-22. If she kept her job at Nassau County Social Services, Medicaid would not fund the home attendant care she needed for daily living. Next slide. Panzerino's case illustrates a conceptual problem that dates back at least to the Social Security Amendments Act of 1956, which defined disability as inability to engage in any substantial gainful activity, making disabled employee a contradiction in terms. Panzerino lobbied for legislative solutions and sued Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare with some success. After founding the Disabled Lesbian Alliance, Panzerino addressed the landmark Sharon Kowalski guardianship case, which demonstrated the consequences of marriage inequality. Next slide. I'm sorry. No, we got it. Okay. No, it's good. So popular culture has made us conversant lately with guardianship and conservatorship, which is the term they use in California. That's crucial to this case. Karen Thompson and Sharon Kowalski lived as closeted lesbians committed to one another. They exchanged rings, shared a house, and named each other as beneficiaries on their life insurance policies. However, when a car accident severely injured Kowalski, her father became guardian and eventually barred Thompson from any contact with Kowalski. Under Panzerino's direction, the Boston Self-Help Center, a peer counseling and advocacy agency for people with disabilities, collected donations to defray Thompson's legal costs. Writing in the alternative press, Panzerino situated the case in the broader context of forces policing the sexuality of people with disabilities and insisted, quote, "It is imperative that we, the disabled, band together, to support our heterosexual and homosexual friends. We must fight all the Kowalskis whose actions have in effect imprisoned Sharon and others like her." In 1991, 4 years after Panzerino published her column, the Minnesota Court of Appeals named Karen Thompson as Sharon Kowalski's legal guardian. Of course, these symposia celebrate the inauguration of Hofstra'S 9th president. With that in mind, I will conclude with one more distinguished alum, namely Ann Coppola, now Ann Coppola Freeman, who appears in Crip Camp. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, we fell behind. There we go. As you can see in the film, after Hofstra, Coppola joined Judy Heumann's Metropolitan New York activist group, Disabled in Action, and took part in a protest that shut down Madison Avenue. She moved to California, worked at the original Center for Independent Living, and participated in the 1977 occupation of the San Francisco office of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare that successfully pressed for implementation of Section 504. She soon became involved with Disability Rights, Education, and Defense Fund, DREDF, a national law and policy center. There she collaborated with two colleagues on No More Stairs, a 1982 book that used text and photographs to make a heterogeneous group of women with disabilities visible. Next slide. A fictional narrative about a girl growing up with a disability forms the book Spine, enriched by photographs and anecdotes from real women of diverse classes and races living with various disabilities. The book very self-consciously presents a range of role models. As its conclusion states, No More Stairs is a book about possibilities, what other women with disabilities have done, what you could do. Coppola also brought her activism into the courtroom as the plaintiff in several anti-discrimination suits. Most importantly, in 1997, she was a lead plaintiff in a successful class action suit that compelled Bay Area Rapid Transit to maintain the elevators in their stations in order to provide people with disabilities with meaningful access to public transit. We can do the last slide. As a law student at Berkeley, Susan Poser worked with DREDF and its Disability Rights Clinic. She contributed to a landmark case in which a woman with cerebral palsy won $520,000 in punitive damages from a restaurant chain that, even after remodeling, failed to provide access ramps. At the time, DREDF attorney Sid Walensky described this as the first jury decision in a wheelchair access case in California and possibly in the country. A year earlier, Walensky, who directed the Disability Rights Clinic, had represented Coppola when she sued American Airlines for refusing to allow her to board a flight to Reno unless she paid to have an attendant accompany her. I close then by noting one more connection and taking heart that formative educational experiences of Hofstra'S 9th president have prepared her to steward this university's heritage of disability activism and advocacy. Thank you.
Can you all hear me okay? Okay, perfect. Hi, my name is Sunjita Bhattacharya, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm a South Asian woman wearing a dark green floral short-sleeved top with a black skirt. I have invisible disabilities, and I grew up as a sibling to someone who's disabled as well, and I'm also a current Hofstra student. I'm going to be speaking to the disability future at Hofstra that I envision. And the first part of that is a future where universal design, especially universal design for learning, reduces the need for individual accommodations. So universal design is a framework for creating systems and structures that seek to make things the most accessible for everyone, regardless of disability. A key part of universal design is constructing things with disabled people's needs in mind first, which ultimately has the latent function of helping several populations. A notable example of this can be seen with curb cuts. While these are made with wheelchair users in mind, people pushing strollers, carts, riding bicycles, pulling suitcases, workers making deliveries, and more benefit from its universal design. Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, aims to apply the theoretical framework of universal design into classrooms, planning with the needs of disabled students in mind, which in turn provides benefits for everyone. So why does this all relate to individual accommodations? Accommodations are often what we point to as a solution to ableism in education. Just go register for accommodations and you can be exempt from all the issues. Unfortunately, it isn't that simple. Accommodations become the student's burden to coordinate, and they're both medicalized and individualized. And by that, I mean that disabled students are the ones responsible for organizing, following up with necessary parties, and making sure that their accommodations are being administered according to what they're entitled to. Many disabled people often end up becoming medical or legal disability experts as a result of this phenomenon repeating throughout their lives. The second aspect of a better disability future at Hofstra is one where the barriers to specialized evaluations do not prevent students from receiving needed accommodations. Getting a diagnosis in order to receive accommodations comes at a cost, both financial and emotional. There are tons of forms to fill out for the university, for doctors, for evaluators, and that's assuming that you get as far as being able to find a doctor or evaluator that's willing to evaluate you accurately, without biases towards people assigned female at birth, for for whom ADHD and autism present differently, or people of color who are often misdiagnosed due to racist beliefs in medicine. And it also assumes that you can afford it. Psych evaluations are usually several $1,000s if you don't have insurance, and if you do have insurance, specialists charge really high copays. For those of you in the audience, just think about how difficult it can be sometimes to navigate your own healthcare establishments and the frustration that might occur of having to coordinate several appointments with specialists who have waiting lists. So now if you're not disabled, imagine adding the challenges of a disability that impairs your ability to conveniently access transportation, a disability that impairs your ability to focus or remember things. This entire process inherently assumes the capability to remember, to not experience executive dysfunction, trauma, or fatigue, and more. It's not made for disabled or neurodivergent people. And oftentimes the limitations behind seeking accommodations in the first place are the exact same skills that the process requires you to perform successfully without help. A better disability future at Hofstra is one where faculty and students understand enough about learning and bodily diversity that students who use accommodations and those who are not visibly disabled are not stigmatized as working the system. Accommodations are only given to a student after meeting a burden of medical proof. The implication of this is often an assumption that you're taking advantage of the system, when in reality, the system is so difficult to navigate that it's significantly more unlikely for someone to successfully deceive their way in. The entire process is also incredibly difficult for students with invisible disabilities, who often feel they're held to a higher burden of proof because they seem neurotypical or non-disabled. And as a result, people assume they're faking it and treat them as such. It's important to note that without a medical diagnosis, students are often not treated as legitimately disabled at institutions such as universities, because in the eyes of authority figures, accommodations signify whether or not you count as really disabled. And this becomes especially problematic if professors, for example, make a rule or set a restriction on what is and is not allowed in the classroom, with the caveat that those registered with SAS are exempt. So what happens to the students who are not yet diagnosed and will now be disadvantaged and left behind? We're stuck individualizing and medicalizing disability as a personal issue that needs a personal solution. And there's definitely benefits to having individualized plans. One size definitely does not fill all, and everyone has different access needs. However, there's a lot of potential for curb-cut initiatives to help everyone in addition to that. Remote learning is an example of that comes to mind. The flexibility of it benefited multiple groups. Students who work, have familial obligations, are experiencing pain or fatigue, benefit from visual and recorded learning, and more. It wasn't just students at greater risk of COVID. And last, universal design frameworks should inform the way that we create safety protocols such as those for COVID-19. We should not assume that all college students have equal vulnerabilities, and we should plan with disabled people in mind, which benefits everyone. Now, I simply do not have the time that I'd like to speak about COVID-19 as someone who's high risk and experiencing the anxieties of that on a daily basis. I will say one thing though, with the time that I do have left, the minimal protocols in place, both on a university level, but also on a nationwide scale, do not do enough to protect high-risk folks. And I'm personally tired of being told people are over it and done with COVID and ready to go back to normal. COVID-19 is not over for disabled people who are currently being rationed out of medical care in hospitals. And not starting with high-risk students' needs first when making safety decisions not only perpetuates ableism, but is fundamentally dangerous for everybody. Universal design with disabled people's needs first is what I envision for the future, but it's also necessary and pressing for the now. I hope that this conversation will spur action to make some of these future goals a reality of our present. As we see with curb cuts, the solutions to these issues have the potential to help everyone. Thank you so much.
Hi, hello, can everybody hear me okay? Yes? Okay. Hi, my name is Bree Hall. I am the Vice President for Dream National. I work with Sunjita very closely, who's just spoken to you. And for people that would benefit from a visual description, I'm a white woman with bright red hair, sitting in a wheelchair, and wearing a bright purple dress. So I'm going to talk more about universal design, but more so architecturally for disabled students here at Hofstra. As of right now, the most pressing issue that our club has brought up to us is that residential housing still doesn't meet their required needs based on their accommodations. What does that mean? It means that dorms, while exceedingly more accessible than what Dr. Rossini was referring to earlier with the 1960s, it still does not meet the same requirements it should today because as the time changed, so does the medical needs. students with physical disabilities often have a hard time finding fully accessible dorms for themselves, and those that are available are very slim to none. Physical disabilities and students with physical disabilities are only allowed to be in 2 current dorm residence halls because not all are fully ADA compliant with showers or automatic doors or other things that those students would need to succeed. And while it works for most people with disabilities, there's even people with invisible disabilities that could benefit from an accessible dorm, but sometimes they simply do not have the resources or the room to be able to inhabit those spaces. Secondly, there is not a fully accessible fire plan as of right now. As of right now, you have to call public safety and let them know that you're on a 2nd or 3rd floor dorm. And while that's a great resource to have, there's no evacuation protocol, meaning there is no way to get the person with a physical disability down the stairs properly and safely. And this leads to a lot of anxiety for a lot of disabled students because if they can't get out of the building, it can end up being a very dangerous situation. Secondly, I want to talk about the architectural barriers that are on campus. There are still so many buildings on campus that only have physical disability entrances on the main level. Without that, a lot of students cannot attend class or have to fight their way through Zoom or in some cases just change classes because the building just doesn't fit their needs. And that's something I'm affected too by personally. And I'm going to piggyback off what Sunjita just said about COVID-19 with the time I have left, because I was informed earlier that the only dorm the university has for quarantining doesn't accommodate physically disabled students. So without that need, if a disabled student comes up COVID-19 positive, they have to, 1, afford their own place to stay, and 2, find a way to get a COVID-19 test before they're allowed back on campus, which leads into my next point about transportation. A lot of disabled students have trouble getting transportation because some New York state laws prohibit them from driving due to their medical conditions. What this means is if they cannot provide their own transportation, they simply cannot get off campus. And for medical needs, that is very, very frightening. If someone were to have a medical emergency here today, there's no guarantee that they could get to a hospital or appropriate care in the amount of time necessary to do so. And lastly, the one point I want to get on as well is dining at Hofstra. Simply, if you are under 5'3" in height, you cannot access the necessary points that the staff in the dining center puts your food on top of. You simply need somebody to be there to assist you to do that still, which can be very difficult if you're not with somebody that's able to help you. And oftentimes it also breaks COVID protocols because you're having to ask the kitchen staff to do that for you. So what me and Sunjita hope to get out of this meeting is that, yes, Hofstra is accessible, but as the world changes, so do people's accessibility needs, and Hofstra needs to do their best to get with the times when it comes to those new and innovative technologies that students might need. And I hope that the conversation we have today will help so that future students at Hofstra can register and truly enjoy their academic experience here without fear or barriers or just simply the stress of being disabled, because sometimes that can be very overwhelming. So I hope this has given insight to some of you, and I hope you can help me, Sunjita, and everybody at DREAM make Hofstra more accessible. Thank you.
Thank you all for having me. My name is Kevin Barry, he, they. I'm wearing a black sports coat, the first I've worn in about a year and a half. Thanks to my co-panelists, some terrific information, and thank you all for being here. I mean, really, truly being here. So what I'm gonna do is, I'm gonna doing this while I'm talking. All right, here's just a quick little table of contents of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start at about 30,000 feet, and I'm going to provide or give you a brief theory of oppression. We come at this in a variety of different ways, different disciplines. This one I found helpful to me in the work that I do, which is in civil rights work, disability rights, and also trans rights. And I should say, I'm happy to send these slides along if any folks find them to be particularly illuminating. If you have phones, feel free to also take a snap here and there if you like anything. And you won't hurt my feelings if you don't. So then I'm going to slide into challenges for disability advocacy, and this is kind of my day-to-day work, so I am a lawyer. When we're arguing on behalf of various folks, we call them litigants when they are in court. What is a litigant? In my experience, they are very brave people who are taking on a fight, who are trying to get something from the other side, who does not want to give it. We'll talk about that. And lastly, I'm going to finish real quickly with what you all can do. All right. So here's my brief theory of oppression. By the way, in my field, in law, we tend to call this subordination, a little bit more of a mouthful. Oppression, I think, is a little bit more easily understood, but kind of a theoretical idea for this is what is this idea of systemic disadvantage based on a certain trait. And when we refer to systemic disadvantage, so we hear a lot about systemic racism, as we should. Here's an idea for framing this. What does it mean to be systemic, this disadvantage based on a trait? Well, I'm suggesting it means all three of these circles that you see at the bottom. When you have all three, it is systemic. You have animus, goes by the word hate. Stereotypes, okay, these sort of generalized, these cognitive shortcuts we take. That person has that trait, therefore they are this. And then societal neglect. And I think we've heard some really important examples of what it is to have societal neglect. Let's look at it in the disability context. Are people with disabilities oppressed? Okay, yes, and this is why we've had the legal response that my co-panelist talked about in terms of the Rehabilitation Act, in terms of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was designed to get rid of what we're seeing here, animus, okay? Stereotypes, societal neglect. And what I didn't do at the beginning of my talk is to say that because I dwell in the area of law and discrimination, some of the examples that I'm going to present are really hard to talk about and to think about. And so I do want to ask, if folks feel like they need to get up and walk out, please do so. I will not judge. These are hard things. These are the hard facts, but my point in raising them here is this is part of the fight that my clients are making, and it's also the reason that the mistreatment they face is oppression. So in terms of disability, we had these what were called ugly laws. These were literally laws on the books that prohibited people with disabilities with cosmetic impairments from leaving their house. Compulsory sterilization, we've seen that. And this is hate. Eugenics. There's also these stereotypes that we see with people with disabilities. And that contributed to educational exclusion. The idea that people with disabilities could not learn. So we were going to exclude them from the public school system. Institutionalization, certainly. And then societal neglect. This is the opposite of universal design. Universal design is the idea that we are going to consider people with disabilities and perhaps people without disabilities and having curb cuts and so forth. The societal neglect is building a built environment without any consideration for people with disabilities whatsoever. So let me get into some examples. This was animus. This was written by one of the justices of the Supreme Court in 1927 who was lauded as an intellect. He also gives us a terrific example of animus against people with disabilities in the infamous case of Buck versus Bell, which upheld compulsory sterilization of people with disabilities, mental health conditions. Stereotypes, and here I'm going to look to pop culture a little bit and also our former president. I don't take any delight in putting Mr. Trump in this slide, but I think it's important to learn from this man. These were stereotypes. We see them in popular culture, Joker, Freddy Krueger, and so forth. And also in this bottom right corner, what goes by the name of disability porn. I'm assuming that I don't need to provide a definition, but the idea that maybe not a quote-unquote negative depiction of people with disabilities, negative stereotype, but one that places people with disabilities on pedestals, and therefore, people would argue, in cages. Okay. And then societal neglect, and this is one of the most contested ones. So people could say, yeah, we get hate and stereotypes, those aren't good, but what do you mean societal neglect? So consider streets without curb cuts rather. Consider our capital, a lot of stairs. Paper money, it's indistinguishable to people with visual impairments. Top right corner, this is a job coach. Some important cases under the ADA where you have employers pushing back on an employee with a disability who wants to have someone there accompany them, to train them. An autistic person working at the front desk of a hotel. Okay. And then, of course, electronic accessibility in the bottom right corner. So this is societal neglect, and yes, people with disabilities experience all of these types of mistreatment. So here, and then I'm going to be done with my theory, who else experiences oppression? And you all can come up with this yourself. Many of these examples are quite obvious, but we could input here, we could put race. We can put gender, okay? We might put certain religions and so forth. We can also play with this a little bit. What about, okay, so are Christians systemically disadvantaged? My argument, raised Catholic, no. This country has been good to folks, at least in terms of neglect and so forth. All right. Intersectionality is those who experience oppression based on multiple traits. Okay, and that's going to be important to what I'm about to talk about. All right. So moving on now to the legal challenges to disability advocacy. So here's a laundry list, and I think all of you could probably come up with others. I've heard additional ones on the panel so far. But here are some of the challenges for disability advocacy going forward. Okay, so in employment, facilitating the ability of workers with disabilities to work from home. I do think COVID has changed the game here. There are court decisions that say absolutely not. Employees cannot work from home. How do we know what they're doing? How do we supervise them? Well, we've just had a grand experiment. But as we see people with disabilities, COVID has impacted them perhaps most of all. Right. Other sources in education, government services, public accommodations. I'm going to concentrate now on this last one. And it's not one that you hear a lot about, not one that we talk a lot about, but what about disability rights laws? Remember, these are the laws that were intended to respond to oppression. But what if on day one I told you we cut some people out of those laws? We said they were not disabled, and we did it very explicitly. We did that with trans people. And I'm using the royal we. This was 1990. Many of you, I'm assuming, weren't born, and like I was, but wasn't all that old. All right. Here's a little background on gender dysphoria and transition. Okay, so gender dysphoria, this is the distress that trans people experience when they're not able to live their life consistent with their gender identity. Okay, so this is what the health professionals define. All right, then there's transition, which is the process by which trans people assert the sex that does correspond with their gender identity. And then there's these WPATH standards of care. Okay, this is the consensus-based medical standards that guide transition. And when you hear about these cases in the news, cases decided under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, Title IX, oftentimes in those facts you have trans litigants, again, these brave folks, many of them have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. All right. So let's kind of skip past that, move things along. This person you're looking at the bottom of this slide has passed away. Person's name was Jesse Helms. He was a senator, a Republican from North Carolina. In the mid-1980s, Jesse Helms saw that trans people, at the time, the term used was transsexualism. It's no longer a term we typically use. Courts were finding that people who were fired for their jobs because they were trans, courts were finding they were protected. They were protected under the Rehabilitation Act. One of my co-panelists just discussed that. That was the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Jesse Helms didn't like that. So he then sought to exclude trans people from other laws. And there was a litany of laws that he did it. But he succeeded here with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Let's take a second to read. This is legislative history statement of Jesse Helms. I'll read it. Mr. President, do we really want private institutions that receive federal funding, particularly schools and daycare centers, to be prohibited from refusing to hire, again, derogatory term that we don't use now, to hire a transvestite, a trans person, because some federal court may find that this violates the person's civil rights to wear a dress and to wear foam, that sort of thing. Do we really want to prohibit these private institutions from making employment decisions based on moral qualifications? It can go on, but what Jesse Helms here is saying is we need to exclude trans people from the Americans with Disabilities Act because of morality. Jesse Helms succeeded. This language is still in the Americans with Disabilities Act today, September 2021, and it's bolded. This is the set of exclusions from the Americans with Disabilities Act. So in bold, transvestism, transsexualism, gender identity disorders not resulting from physical impairments. So here's an example of excluding a certain subset of people from disability laws. There is a diagnosis. And by the way, I think this gives rise to interesting and important questions of medicalization. But nevertheless, there is a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, and yet they are excluded. They didn't used to be. They were included, and now they are excluded. So the effort that I was a little part of began in 2014 with this brave woman, Caitlin Blatt. And she brought a lawsuit in Pennsylvania, and she won. She was fired, otherwise harassed, because she was a trans person with a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. She sued and won. And what the court did, and I don't need to get too far into this, but essentially found that gender dysphoria is different than those words that Jesse Helms excluded 30 years ago. Now, from Caitlin Blatt, we have these. This is what happens when you're able to provide some protections. The ADA certainly can't do it all. Law can't do it all, but it can do some things. This theory now has helped to provide trans employees who are misgendered. It's helped incarcerated folks, and I'm going to show a few slides on that, access appropriate sex-segregated facilities and transition care in prison. And it's helped to overturn some exclusions for transition-related care in health insurance. Okay, so I know these aren't like the most like super exciting terms, but they're a big deal for people generally. For trans folks, and we're talking about transition-related health care, and we're talking about health care for people who are incarcerated. So just a few examples, and I'll provide a few slides here. So Angelina Resto, so the first incarcerated trans person in the country to secure transfer from a men's prison to a woman's prison following a court order. And again, under this theory that the ADA provide. Here's Andre Edmo, who was the first incarcerated trans person to secure transition surgery following a court order. Here's Skylar J. Yes, one of the stars of Queer Eye. You can look him up. He went, sued his employer in Georgia. The case settled. University of Georgia's plan now provides trans-inclusive health care. Similarly, Sergeant Lang, down again in Georgia, suing her employer, a county, for refusing to provide trans-inclusive health care. So that's in a nutshell kind of the legal arc, some of the work that I'm involved in at the intersections of disability and trans rights. So I think what I want to do with my last couple minutes is to provide you just with a few ideas of what you can do. And I think instinctively, particularly now, I think with social media, and I think hopefully our education system's getting better at this, but to kind of put in one place the sort of things that you all can do. This is my meager attempt. I'm sure there are other things that you can think about, but I like to think about it in terms of personal life and professional life. So one is you just educate yourself and others about oppression. You all are doing it here because you showed up. There's terrific books. I've listed a few. Documentaries, we've already heard about one of them, Crip Camp. Disclosure, by the way, is a terrific one on kind of the trans community and depictions in media. Instagram, these are a few handles that my spouse, like. I think read a bit on, and Lydia might be able to enlighten us a bit as well. Some other things in your personal life. Confront oppression in your community. This is not always comfortable, but I think it's really important. Protests, certainly. And you all have seen examples of this. Put pressure on government officials, okay? Vote them in, vote them out, if you can vote. And if you can't, let's try to get some voting rights for those who don't have them. Volunteer, join nonprofit organizations, and I put at the bottom, write checks. To me, that's not a cop-out. I've been served on the board of nonprofit organizations. We like money. So, you're not done once you write the check, but writing the check helps, okay. And then in your professional lives, here's some ideas. Hopefully, Hofstra'S giving you some ideas about this. But, careers in government, absolutely. Conducting academic research, and then creating or working at some important nonprofits. We've heard about some of them. Bazelon Center for Mental Health is one of them. Just a terrific organization. There are certainly many, many others. Consider going to law school like I did, or don't go to law school. Do something else. Obtain some training. I heard this terrific interview with a Black Lives Matter protester this past summer. It was on NPR, and they were asking the woman, what do you wish you had known kind of then that you know now? And the protester was like, when I was in the street, when I was confronting racism, when I was looking police officers in the eye and saying, stop this violence, I thought that was it. And what she was talking about is I didn't realize that there is a system, and this system turns slow. But legal education or other kind of policy education can help you understand that system and then make those changes that the community organizers and the public are giving us, okay? The two are always interactive, culture and law. And then in your day-to-day jobs, find creative ways to address oppression. I'm going to just finish with this photo. So this is a sepia tone photo of folks marching over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. This is now the stuff of good movies. But back in my day, these were the black and white photos that I was seeing when I was looking at the history books, okay? This is now like pretty old history. Okay, we're like 60 years on. But these folks in this picture taught me something. And they don't know me. They didn't know me. But I saw white folks in back. I saw black folks in front. That made an impression on me. I think that's right. And I also saw the people marching together. You all, sometimes I have students who say, I just want to help people. And they feel like they have to put more gloss on that that's just not enough, that maybe they need to, insert some like really important, whatever, kind of pedagogical or fancy words. I'm giving you a license to say that wanting to help people is enough. It distinguishes you. Now, the people you want to help may be your people. It may be other people. You got to come correct. There's ways to do this, but wanting to help people distinguishes you. We need more people like that. And so, 50 years down the road, your picture, your dusty sepia tone picture will be motivating others. And that's how this process works. So thank you all for being here. I'm happy to take some questions afterwards.
Good afternoon. I'm Lydia, pronouns they, them. I'm a youngish East Asian person with short black and teal hair, and today I am wearing, for one of the first times in public, this very snazzy teal jacket. Also, have not really been in public with people for like over a year, so this is weird. and highly uncomfortable. Like very weird, very uncomfortable, and I don't think I like it. I also don't think literally any of us are feeling very okay right now, and that even those of you who might believe that you are okay aren't. Raise your hand if you feel great. I saw 2 tentative hands kind of shyly creep. You're lying. I don't believe you. You are not doing as great as you think you are. Not to dictate to you your own reality, but to point out that over the past year and a half, we have collectively survived an experience of collective trauma. We have experienced the collective trauma of witnessing literal mass death caused and exacerbated by deliberate failures of policy, of preparedness, of implementation. Failures that have fallen the hardest and the harshest on multiply marginalized communities. Failures that it is impossible for us to reckon with or understand without an adequate understanding of what ableism is as a value system and how it deliberately pervades, underlies, and undergirds all of the ways that we construct our societal, cultural, and political realities. I'm joining you here on a university campus, and left unquestioned and unnamed is the role of the university itself as a purveyor and perpetrator of eugenics practice and theory. Eugenics is a theory and an idea that we like to believe, if we're being a little nicer to ourselves, existed in the past, that it does not exist realistically anymore. And that's in large part because of a successful PR campaign, where we associate the term eugenics with the Nazi era, the Third Reich, and only with the Nazi era. And we think, well, that was what the Nazis did. Well, you know what? Adolf Hitler was inspired by the United States. Adolf Hitler expressed open admiration for the United States' policies systematically and institutionally of anti-blackness, of anti-indigeneity, and of ableism. The ways in which the US literally created whole carceral institutions to disappear, to cage, and to eliminate negatively racialized people and disabled people, particularly those of us that lie at that intersection. My co-panelists talked about ableism as it shows up in stereotyping, as it shows up in access, as it shows up in neglect, and as it shows up in animus. What is left unsaid is that ableism at its core is a system of power relations. It is a system of power relations and power differentials that teaches us both what kinds of people whose body minds are human, have full personhood, who is valuable, worthy, and desirable, whose lives are worth living, whose lives are worth protecting, whose lives are worth saving. And it teaches us whose lives are expendable and disposable, whose lives are not worth living, not worth saving, not worth protecting, who is not a full person. And so ideas of ableism profoundly pervade every other form of oppression that exists in this society. Ableism itself is both necessary for and dependent on every other form of oppression. To understand ableism in this nation and its long and continued history and legacy of oppression and violence, we cannot do so or reckon with it honestly without understanding its role in and its reliance upon racism, upon white supremacy, upon settler colonialism, upon patriarchy. Eugenics was at home in the United States at the turn of the century from the 19th to the 20th, and it was hailed as a progressive movement. This is the future of science, the future of selecting for the ideal person, for the improved person. A future that is for the most fit, the most fecund white people. How can we reproduce those who are fit to reproduce and reduce and eliminate the reproductive capacity of those who are not fit to reproduce? The university itself is situated on the false ideal and the mythology of meritocracy, of the life of the mind, of intellectual curiosity. And I think, I hope, that most of us who are here now, who are present in this room, know and understand that the idea of scientific objectivity or neutrality is itself a myth. There is no such thing as objectivity. There is no such thing as this supposed neutral understanding of what it means to have attained knowledge or what it means to understand literature or the historical record or scientific discovery. But the mythology of intelligence or intellect as a defining characteristic of what makes a person fit, what makes a person worthy, what can be a determinative factor in deciding whether or not a person can embody the ideal of ableness, which itself is wrapped up with ideas of whiteness, of capital, of masculinity, is core to the university. You are present on a university campus if you have been deemed adequately intelligent, whether explicitly through the use of quantitative testing for admissions, or whether implicitly through the belief that merely by being present, attaining an education in this formalized, structured way, you have proven yourself to be intellectually capable, unlike unnamed others who lack educability, who are incapable of being recognized or understood as intellectual or cognitively capable or competent persons. Eugenics has never been far from the university. It is part and parcel of the structure of the academy as an institution. When I think about what it means to look to the future of a university, where we could be, I think about where we've been, I think about where we are now. I think about the fact that we are sitting in this room in person. Well, I guess I'm standing, but we're here. And across this country, every one of our universities has been moving toward as close to a full reopening as possible. Why? Because of the pervasive belief that there's one right way to learn. There's one right way to be in relationship with people. There's one right way to interact with people. There's an ideal way and there's a less ideal way. And what we've always known is that being able to gather in person is great. It enables access in so many ways. And it inhibits, prevents, and precludes access in so many other ways. There is no such thing as one space or one way of doing things that is perfectly accessible to every single person. There's no way to construct a space, a curriculum, an organization or institution that perfectly meets and responds to the needs of every single person that might come into contact with it. But in the face of a raging global pandemic, where as of today, a minuscule percentage in the single digits of all vaccine doses have gone to people living in the global south, why? Why are we insisting that it is equally okay or safe for us all to be present in one physical location? Why is it that our education would have us believe that the quality of our education is superior if it is delivered in a face-to-face instructional methodology? This is deeply tied to notions of race and class and disability. Why? Because prior to COVID-19, distance learning programs, hybrid learning programs, and online learning programs were most closely associated with and prevalent in predatory and exploitative master's programs, adult continuing education and diploma completion programs, and programs that are largely marketed to generationally working class or impoverished communities, immigrant communities, particularly immigrant communities of color, to people who are currently or formerly incarcerated, people who are or who have experienced homelessness, people who, in other words, are excluded from the idea of the academy as the elite institution for wealth-privileged, non-disabled white people who can embody the idea and the tradition of white power and white privilege. And so, even during COVID-19, the most intense parts of what most of us had experienced, of near universal quarantine and lockdown, our professors, our faculty, my colleagues, would insist on engaging in and requiring more stringent requirements for attendance, for participation, for assignments, for daily logs or daily responses to readings as a way of attempting to prove our education is sufficiently rigorous. Our education is still sufficiently competitive. You are still being forced to learn. You have to prove that you're not just slacking off. We're not delivering a lesser quality of instruction. Why? Because we're expected to prove that we're still intelligent. We're not doing that awful reputation online education program thing. Why is it an awful reputation? Because it's associated with people who are racially marginalized, who are class oppressed, and who are disabled. That's why. And now we're present, and we are still not able to confront not only the realities of the mass death still happening right now, we do not allow ourselves the opportunity to consider what access actually is. Access is not a checklist. Access is not an end destination. Access is not something that you can attain by rigorously following laws, complying with regulations, going through 10, 20 different trainings. Access is relational. Access is complex. Access is fluid. The work that I do is informed by the framework of disability justice. And disability justice, which was a framework co-created largely by Black and brown and queer and trans disabled people, is intentionally and centrally intersectional. That is, drawing on the work of Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, disability justice understands that our analysis of both disability and of ableism cannot exist in a vacuum. That our analysis of disability and ableism must understand the ways in which how we mediate disability, how we recognize disability, and how we shape our social and cultural policies around and in response to disability are deeply tied to our understandings of race and racial power relations, are deeply tied to the existence and the perpetuation of capitalist oppression, are deeply tied to the existence and the perpetuation of patriarchal and misogynistic oppression. That the oppression of queer and trans people is deeply tied to the oppression of disabled people. And that if we don't understand those connections and those realities, we will not be able to reckon with ableism's past or present, nor will we be able to imagine a future. Disability justice teaches us that the work of access always happens in relationship and in community. Disability justice teaches us that in order to understand the violence that this pandemic has wreaked on our lives and our communities, the violence the pandemic has wrought, particularly in prisons and institutions where it is primarily Black and brown disabled people who are incarcerated, that the violence the pandemic has wrought on people in essential working positions, people who are largely immigrants of color, disabled with caregiving responsibilities, that the violence of the pandemic in teaching us whose lives are even worth granting PPE to, or life-saving treatment to, or access to the vaccines, that understanding is necessary to think about what do we want instead. Ruth Wilson Gilmore teaches us that abolition is a project not of absence, but of presence. So too is disability justice. It is a project not merely about naming, understanding, and examining the ways in which ableism pervades our thinking, the ways in which ableism is so deeply entrenched in our society that no amount of legal or policy change will alone disappear it. But it is also an invitation and an opportunity to us to consider what we want to be present. This is not working. This is broken. This is unsustainable. What do we want instead? What would it look like or feel like to be cared for? What would it be like to know that you are believed? To know that your presence is not only made possible, but is valued and desired? What would it mean for us to be speaking of the legacies of trauma, of sterilization, of dehumanization, of erasure, of disappearance, as just that, as histories? What would it mean for us to be able to move through and inhabit worlds where we are loved, where we are valued, where we are wanted, where we belong? That is the provocation and the invitation of disability justice for our future. Thank you.
In the few minutes that we have remaining, we'd invite anyone who has a question for any of our panelists to please step up or come up to the mic. And if you are not able to come up to the mic, I can make that happen.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gina Barber. I'm from the class of 2019 here at Hofstra University, and I'm also a 1999 graduate of the Henry Viscardi School. So a lot of what has been presented today is very dear and close to my heart as an advocate. Sorry, is the mask. So as an advocate for people with disabilities, I just wanted to share a quick story. Here at Hofstra, I know that the students that are on the panel had brought up curb cuts. And back in 2011, when I started here at Hofstra, I had a class over in CV Star. My card did not work in the door. They had directed me to go to public safety. When I left CV Star and started heading down California Avenue, I realized that I either had to go in the street or I had to go in an active parking lot to get to public safety to get my card looked at. I'm like, not only is this dangerous, somebody's gonna get seriously hurt. So I started in 2011 with the advocacy of starting to figure out, how am I gonna do this? So I entered an advocacy for writing class in my junior year here at Hofstra. And I learned how to write effectively to get my message across. And the curb cuts were installed finally in my senior year. So I'm very, very grateful that I was able to make some kind of change moving forward here at Hofstra. But another thing I had a question real quick for. I have been a litigant in several cases. And the term blackball has come into conversations now because I've litigated so many cases for advocacy. And to me, the word blackball means nothing to me because I'm getting positive change. So everybody here today needs to realize that there is an opportunity for positive change. We all need to work together. And as an alumni, I'm more than happy to come back and do whatever I can to help this place be a more accessible place. Thank you.
Before I ask my question, I appreciate the story that was shared that touched my heart, so thank you for sharing. So first of all, I struggle with a disability, so my question was, how can I recognize my disability as an identity rather than a label? And how can I better understand other people with disabilities?
No, I'll start, but other people can add.
I was asking this question specifically for Lydia, but anyone else is more welcome to add in.
This is Lydia. The word label, I believe, has a bad reputation. We use it in a very dismissive way to say, well, you shouldn't label people, or I don't want to be defined by labels, or using labels for people is actually dismissive or it's derogatory. But the reality is, just thinking linguistically, we use labels for fucking everything. There are labels on literally all of our products. There are labels on our rooms, at least I hope there are, or I will be hopelessly lost and you'll never find me again. And we use labels as shorthand for describing ourselves and other people. Some of those labels we don't think much about, like student or faculty member, and other of those labels we attach very intense meaning to. Your question was about how you can think about being disabled as an identity for yourself rather than simply being a label, and I think that's the wrong question. The labels that we use to describe ourselves are simply shorthands for parts of who we are. If your disability is formative in defining who you are and is a core part of your identity, then that's it. That is literally all you have to do, is recognize, for me, being disabled is part of who I am. It is part of your identity. There's no form, like form W892, that you declare, aha, disability is now part of my identity. That's weird. It's not a thing. Being disabled can be political, it can be communal, it can be cultural, and it's how you relate to it. What do you find meaning in when you think of yourself as a disabled person? If other people use disability as a way to put a label or ideas onto you, it's kind of their problem. Of course, it is your problem if that affects the way in which they treat you, the ways in which they interact with you. But to think about disability as an identity is simply a shift in one's own mindset. What does it mean for me to embrace this part of my life experience, this part of who I am? Good luck, and welcome to the disability community.
I think building on that, especially the last point that Lydia made, to me, one of the differences would be understanding yourself as an individual and understanding yourself as part of a community, right? The label is something we stick on individual items often, but when you see yourself as part of a larger community, then I think you're moving toward identity.
Hi, my name is Zaha Morfojan. I'm a art therapy graduate student with autism and Ehlers-Danlos, and I see a lot of lawyers, but I was wondering if you have any recommendations for people entering counseling and therapy professions where we could find other disabled people, since the field is kind of paternalistic and alienating. Thank you.
Email me. Don't expect a response for a while because of the ADD abyss of despair. But I know a lot of openly neurodivergent and otherwise disabled people in the counseling fields.
Thank you.
I want to thank all of our panelists today for their experiences that they shared with us and their knowledge that they shared with us. And thank you all for joining us, and we wish you a wonderful rest of your day.